Hello everyone, and warm welcome from ITRPV. During this tough time, we hope you and your family and teams are safe and healthy. I am Trang, a market specialist for ITRPV Solar, and today we are happy to have Marc Korevaar, a scientist at Kipp Zonen, which is a product brand of ITRPV. So before we start the webinar, there is a few housekeeping rules for the webinar. First of all participants will be permanently on mute. Secondly, session shall be recorded and will be shared with all the registered participants. And the chat box to be used for questions during the webinar. Questions shall be answered after the webinar. If we haven't had a chance to answer all of your questions, we will follow up for the open end and rest of the question, and we have the team to follow up with you for your questions. So thank you everyone, and thank you Marc for being here. So for now, I will hand over to you Marc for the presentation. I hope you all have a great section.
Thank you, Trang, for the introduction, and a welcome to everyone from wherever you are, whether it's Europe, India, Asia Pacific, or Africa. Today, the topic is bifacial PV, and it's about monitoring the Rearside IRradiance and Albedo. And as a change from a normal protocol, I'll start with the summary so you guys know what we're working towards in the webinar. And the summary contains some of the common uses of irradiance data. So why would you measure in a bifacial PV site? It is to do site prospecting for having an investment decision, but also once your plant is built, to calculate your performance ratio. And a change from the monofacial plant with the bifacial plant is that instead of using the plane of array in the performance ratio formula, now we use the effective irradiance. So that is in the new standard. That's the plane of array plus the plane of array rear times V. And the details will follow in the webinar. Some other reasons to measure irradiance is to be able to plan maintenance and to compare different sites amongst each other. So how are you going to measure for a bifacial plant? It is with a pyranometer class C or better. And how do you install the bifacial pyranometers? Well, the standard now says that you use a multiple of sensors, so 3 sensors, to calculate an effective average of the Rearside IRradiance. And we'll also be talking about the details of where in the plant, and the conclusion works towards that you mount the sensors away from the edges. So here the sensor reading is compared from the center of the plant, and you see that if you mount the sensor at the edges, you would be measuring too much irradiance. So now that we had the summary at the end, we can go to the agenda of today. So we'll start with some introduction on the bifacial principles. Then we go into the reasons for measuring irradiance in bifacial plants and how to measure it, and where to place the Rearside pyranometers. And then we'll finish with a bit about performance ratio and some more insights, and then we'll finish off with recommendations from our side. Now, here we see 2 images. On the left, we see a monofacial module, how it's built up with a transparent, typically glass front side and a non-transparent back sheet. And sunlight comes from the front and contributes to the power generation. On the right, we see a setup of a bifacial module with both a transparent front and rear covering. And what enables that, together with the bifacial solar cells in between, what enables that is that you can also generate power from light that hits the rear of the module. So that can be reflected from the ground or reflected from clouds. Now, this principle is not very new. It is from the 1960s, devised by Mr. Mori. But we've seen commercial pickup of this only recently, with a market growth of more than 500 megawatt peak since plus minus 2017. Now, there are 2 flavors of bifacial plants. They come on one hand as a fixed bifacial plant, of which you see an example here. This is a bifacial plant in Chile, South America. And you can see that the modules are mounted on a fixed racking. And in literature, typical bifacial gains for these type of plants are between 5 and 15%, depending on how the plant is optimized. The other flavor of bifacial plants are tracked, typically single-axis tracked bifacial plants, of which you see an example here from the Roadrunner plant in Texas, USA. And then the bifacial modules are mounted on horizontal single-axis trackers. They can be either with the axis of rotation going from east to west or from north to south. And typical bifacial gains reported are 3 to 11%. And this is on top of the gain that a tracked site already delivers over a fixed site. Now, some of the ways that bifacial gain can be optimized are by a number of points, and we'll go through some of them here. One is the bifaciality factor, and this is a material parameter. So this depends on the modules that you use, and this bifaciality factor is typically defined as what would the rear of the module produce if it's irradiated at the same irradiance as the front of the module. And typically that's a bit less. So that can be somewhere from 70% to 95%. And a possible value would be roughly 81%. So this influences how much gain you get from your bifacial plant. Another factor of influence is the tilt angle or the latitude at which the plant is located. If the plant is located at a larger, higher latitude, then the modules are typically tilted more, and you will get more light on the rear side of the module, and therefore also a larger bifacial gain. Now, another factor of influence you see in the photo on the left here, there is natural vegetation, which is green, but below the modules, they have placed white stones to enhance the ground surface albedo and therefore get more light on the rear of the modules. Some other factors of influence are the clearance height from the ground. So on the right, you see an image of the plant that was already shown before, where the modules are mounted relatively high from the ground. And when you do that, you get more light on the rear of the modules. Another factor of influence is the ground coverage ratio, or basically how much spacing is there in between the rows and also in between the modules. And if you have more spacing in between the modules, you get more light on the ground, and then also more light reflected on the rear of the modules. That's sort of the similarity between both these things, like the clearance height and the ground coverage ratio. If you enhance that, you get more light on the rear of the module. Now, additionally, using single axis trackers, you can further enhance the amount of power that you generate per land area. So if you have a limited land area or a high price for land area, it makes sense to use single axis trackers because you will enhance the power output per land area. Now we have done some simulations and would like to show some results to give you a bit of a feel for how these different factors quantitatively influence the bifacial gain. So we have here a simulation of the bifacial gain as function of the albedo, and you typically see a more or less linear dependence. And on the right here, you see such an albedo enhancer. This is on the Kipp measurement roof. It's a piece of white fleece which has a relatively high albedo. Now, another thing we've looked at is what is the effect of the time of day. So here we see the bifacial gain as a function of the time of the day in orange, and we see that because of changes in solar zenith angle, you have a higher bifacial gain in the early hours and the late hours of the day, and it is lowest around solar noon. And that's where also the majority of the energy will be generated. So it's dependent on the time of the day. And additionally, it's also dependent on the season. So here we have simulated for 4 different months of the year. They are in the winter, spring, summer, and fall. And then we see that around the summer, the bifacial gain is the largest. Of course, the outcome will depend a bit on the location where you simulate, because it's not only the solar zenith angle which influences this, but also the weather type. So the amount of diffuse to global, and also the albedo. If you have snow in winter, for instance, you would get a higher bifacial gain in winter. Now, another factor that we talked about before is the height that you mount the modules. And here there is the results of a simulation from a height of roughly 0.2 meters above the ground to 2 meters above the ground. And we see that with increasing mounting height, the bifacial gain increases, but it sort of flattens off a bit the curve. So in the beginning, the gain is much larger than it is at for instance, a height increase from 1.5 to 2 meters. Some other factors we talked about before is the influence of the tilt angle or the latitude. Here, there are the bifacial gains of 4 locations on the Earth with, in the order of increasing latitudes and therefore also increasing optimal tilt angles. And we see that for the location in the Netherlands, the bifacial gain is the largest, because there is more light reaching the rear of the module because the tilt is more. And similarly, there is an influence of the weather type. So we see that for a clear sky weather, the percentual bifacial gain is smaller than if we have cloudy weather. However, it has to be said that absolute gains, so the watt-hour gains, might be still larger in some lower latitudes and clear conditions. Now that we've been showing a bit about the bifacial and some of its background, I would like to talk about why to measure solar irradiance and how to measure it in bifacial plants. So why measure irradiance? It is can be divided in different phases. So you have the early development phase when you do prospecting of the location and make a selection for a certain PV system, whether fixed or tracking. You have the pre-construction phase when it's about making a long-term energy assessment or making an investment decision. And then you have the operational phase where you are monitoring the system performance and calculating a performance ratio, where you want to plan your maintenance. So you want to see when the performance ratio starts to get to a certain level that you want to do maintenance, and when you want to compare sites amongst each other. So this is some reasons why to measure. And then how can you measure it? Well, we see 2 ways to measure it. One is that you do an albedo measurement, and that can be done with an albedometer, such as you see here. It consists of a pyranometer that is mounted upward and downward, and then the albedo, what you want to measure, is defined as the reflected irradiance from the ground, measured by the lower pyranometer, divided by the global irradiance measured by the top pyranometer. Now, and how are the recommendations for mounting such an albedometer? That is and by the way, this is typically used for the prospecting and the pre-construction phase, as well as for the operational phase. But the mounting guidelines are at least 1 meter height, and it can be larger than 1 meter. It would be beneficial to have that 1.5 meter, but the minimum requirement is 1 meter height, and that you make sure that you minimize any shading by the sensor itself or by the support structure, which you can see done very well on the photo here on the right. You want the site to be unobstructed, so you don't want trees in the vicinity. You want them, as you can see here, far away enough. And it's also essential that the land below the albedometer is representative of the land of the site. Now, some typical albedos that you can get is that for let's say grass, you can have something below 0.2 if it's very green grass, or it's a bit above 0.2, such as here 0.25 if it's a bit more yellow grass. And for desert sand, it's typically a bit larger. It can be 0.4, and if you have snow, then it is quite large, 0.8. Now, where in the plant would you place such an albedometer? And then, yeah, as we said before, it's important that the land below the albedometer is representative of the land of the site. So you would tend to have it not too far away from the site. And if you have a large variation of the ground below the PV site, then it would be wise to use an appropriate number of sensors to capture that variation. What's important for the rest is that you don't have significant shading on the land where the albedometer is located. And a rule of thumb can be that you have 80-degree angle free horizon. So that means that if you have, let's say, a structure of 2 meters high, perhaps from the racking of a PV module, then you want to be roughly 6 times 2 meters, so 12 meters away from that structure. So that's a rule of thumb. Now, the other way to measure irradiance in bifacial plants is by measuring the plane of array rear. And the plane of array rear is caused by a number of things. And mostly is the ground reflected and the diffuse light that comes from the clouds. But in certain higher latitudes and certain times of the year, you can have a bit of DNI in the very early and very late hours of the solar day. But that is not very relevant for energy production. Now, typically, this is something that you would do in operational phase monitoring, because you would like to have the sensors mounted on the modules themselves. And when placing the sensors, it's good if they are in a location where the irradiance is representative of most of the modules, and you don't have enhanced shading or illumination due to racking. So where in the plant would you place them? Again, as said, where it's representative of the majority of the modules. And in this presentation, we'll be going into the question, in which row would you like to place them, where in the row, and at which height on the PV modules should you place them. Now we move to the next section, where we're gonna talk about the placement of the rear-side pyranometers. And we have been active as Kipp Zonen in this area. We have done measurements on our roof setup. So here you see an albedometer mounted above a white surface. And here you see the bifacial roof setup with multiple bifacial modules. And in between these two Yingli bifacial modules, we have the plane of array rear pyranometers mounted below. And the way that looks like, we can see in the next slide, where we see an image from the lower side of the bifacial module with, in this case, 6 pyranometers mounted in a line. Now, what we've noticed when we looked at measurements of these 6 pyranometers, we see a variation depending on the location. So pyranometer number 1 is, the measurement position is here. It corresponds to the lowest mounted pyranometer. And pyranometer 6, the measurement here corresponds to the top pyranometer. And these measurements were done on the 7th of April 2020. And what we see a variation of the irradiance measurement by up to a factor 2.8, and we see a minimum in the sort of the middle of the module, and we see a maximum at the lowest part, and it's also maybe roughly around 50% in the top part. And we see that the shape of the curve is quite constant for different times of the day. Now, to make a broader assessment of mounting recommendations, we have employed a software tool called Bifacial Radiance, and this was developed by NREL, and the links are below here if you're interested in it. This software has been extensively validated by, amongst others, NREL and Sandia labs, and we have used it here as a model to come with recommendations of the position of pyranometers on the rear of the module and the position of the pyranometer within the plant. The way Bifacial Radiance works is that it works within Python, and it uses a ray tracing method. And there have been validations done that show that the bifacial gains calculated with the software are within 1 or 2% of the actually achieved bifacial gains. As an input for the simulation, you need the 3 solar components and an albedo value. And it consists of a software interface you see on the right here, where you can select the location on the Earth. You can select fixed or tracking. You can select the tracking method, things about the torque tube, the amount of modules, the amount of rows, and the amount of measurement sensors you want to use. So a lot of options you can tune. Now we have, for this occasion, simulated a plant where we have a landscape-oriented 4 modules high fixed setup, and this is similar as what's on this photo. This is a plant in Ukraine, but we have chosen Saudi Arabia as a simulation location. And when we place pyranometers at different sites in the plant, then we have compared the reading to the center. So this is the center measurement, and then we can see that if you place the pyranometers at the edge of the row, you measure roughly 95% more than if you have it in the center. And if you move towards away from the edge towards the center, then this figure goes down. But at the 3rd module, it's still 16% too much. And the same we see when we go to the northernmost row, so the row that has less shading on land above the modules. There we see still 11% too much. So our advice here is to move at least 3 modules away from the row edges and stay at least 1 row interior from the northernmost row. We also looked at the effect we see when placing the pyranometer at different positions on the rear of the modules. And we have 6 different measurement locations. And when we look at the yearly average, we see the simulation results here. Then we see that, again, as on the measurements on the roof, we have a maximum when we measure closest to the ground, as well when we measure at the top of the module, and we have a minimum in between. And when we would select a single position that is representative of the average of the module, then we would end up approximately here at roughly 70%. And of course, this depends on the conditions at the particular site, and it also depends on the design of the plant. And when you look at this not from a yearly perspective, but from a perspective at certain times of the day, then we see here the rear irradiance with the irradiance on the y-axis and the position on the module on the horizontal axis. We see that at 8 o'clock in the morning and at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the shape is fairly similar. So in this case, if you're looking at different times of the day, you could say you could live with a single pyranometer location. However, if you're looking at different times of the year, and we do that here by having plotted the simulation results for February as well as for June, we see that the shapes are significantly different. And therefore, in this case, we could not select a ideal pyranometer position. So a solution we think in this case would be to place multiple pyranometers on the rear side in order to capture the average irradiance on the module. Now we've also looked at what happens if you look at the cumulative measurement. So you can look at a single time point, so a single month, but you can also look at the cumulative effect of a whole year. So here we have plotted the difference to the actual average irradiance on the module with in orange a 1 measurement position and in blue a 3 measurement position solution. And then we can see that as time progresses, both the 1 measurement position and the 3 measurement position come closer to the average. So if you look at the cumulative effect of a year, they are both closer to the true average than when you only consider 1 month. And what we can also see that if we use 3 measurement positions, we are always much closer to the true average than when we have only a single measurement position. Now we've also made a slide with some implications for different time measurements. There is a new IEC 61724-1 standard, which recommends a 1-minute recording interval for Class A plants with a maximum of 5-minute recording intervals. And it's also prescribed there to have a maximum of 5-second samples for a Class A site. This applies to, amongst others, irradiance measurements, but also to other measurements. What we see in practice, however, is that albedo, it typically changes a bit slower over time than the plane of array and the plane of array rear. So you would expect that measurement to be a lot more constant than the plane of array and the plane of array rear. When it comes to processing the data, of course, it depends on what your period of interest is. Now we're going to move on to a tracked bifacial plant simulation. For this, we have chosen a 2-panel portrait plant design as, for instance, is shown here on the photo in Texas. And as a location, we've also chosen Texas. And the data that comes out of a measurement at such a plant can look like the graph on the left here. So we have the irradiance on the left axis, and on the right axis, we have the power output of the plant. And here is the data on over the time of 1 day. So we see that the plane of array has a maximum in the middle morning and in the afternoon, with sort of a little dip in the center. And if you look at the plane of rear, so the irradiance that's coming from the rear, we see that that has a clear maximum at solar noon, and it is lower than the plane of array front. And when we look at the power output, therefore we see that the power output is a bit more flat than the plane of array front. And now we've also done the simulation where we compare different positions of installation. So we compared everything to the center position, where we measure an average irradiance of 37 watts per square meter. Again, if we place the pyranometer on the most southern point of the center row, we measure 66% too much, as is shown here in the table. And if we also consider the front plane of array, then it means that the total plane of array would be roughly 12% too much, 12% more than the average of the plant. And that would mean that your performance ratio calculation is also impacted by 12%. So your performance ratio would be 12% lower than it would actually, or it should be. Now, other measurement locations, when you take like the westernmost row, we see that the measurement is 10% too much. And if you move away from the edge, we have yeah, 12% too much. So again, the advice is place the sensors away from the edges and not on the westernmost and easternmost row. Now, we've also looked at the impact of the mounting position along the module. You can see an image here with 3 mounting positions, and you can see the yearly average simulation on the right. So you see mounting position number 1, 2, and 3. And we see that there are the maxima again at the edges, so position 1 and 3. And in this case, the center has a bit of a dip, and that is because of some shading by the torque tube. And if you would look at the impact on the performance ratio calculation, so more on the plane of array total, then we see that they are not as big as for the simulations on the fixed plant. Now, we've also looked at particular times, so not only a yearly average, but particular times of the year. And in this case, in the summer, 21st of June at 10 in the morning and at 2 in the afternoon. And then we see that this shape of the irradiance along the module. So here you have the lowest part of the module, here the highest part of the module. You see the irradiance on the y-axis. Then we see that there is an asymmetry in the morning, but around solar noon, this asymmetry is gone. It's symmetrical, and because of that, yeah, and again we see the shading because of the torque tube. But because of that, it is pretty difficult to position a pyranometer in such a place that you always measure the average irradiance. You would be underestimating if you would place it here and overestimating if you place it there. So if you choose one position, it would be good to know this limitation, but our advice is to use multiple measurement positions. If you look at different seasons of the year, and here we have plotted June and February, we see, of course, that in June there is more irradiance than in February, as we would expect. And we see that around solar noon, when the trackers are more or less horizontal, the distribution is symmetrical. So if you would only be interested in different seasons and not in the smaller time scale as time of the day, then you could choose a measurement position wisely, but still to capture any variations, well, it would be wise to use multiple measurement positions. Now we've talked about placement of the pyranometers. Now we'll move on to a bit about performance ratio and some other considerations. So as many of you are certainly aware, there has been a new version of the IEC 61724-1. It's about monitoring, and the other two versions of this standard, -2 and -3, are about other things than monitoring. The -2 is about the system capacity test, and -3 is about system energy evaluation. And in -1 that is where the performance ratio formula is in. And with the new release of the standard this summer, it is very nice that there is a formula for bifacial performance ratio calculation. And the way to do it is either from actual measurements of plane of array and plane of array rear, or alternatively to use global horizontal irradiance, plane of array, and horizontal albedo to obtain a modeled plane of array rear. And what this new standard also states is that the amount of plane of array rear sensors should be 3 times the number of plane of array front sensors. And the reasoning behind it is that in that way you can better capture the non-constant irradiance distribution on the rear of the modules. And the way how to measure it is with a pyranometer class C or better, or with a working reference PV device. Now, what does the standard say about the performance ratio calculation? It says something about what to do for monofacial plants, which we will go through first, and then later on we will go through what it says for bifacial plants. So in essence, what it says to calculate the PV system yield, which is the energy output of the plant divided by the power rating. So, and the power rating is usually the DC power rating at standard test conditions, and the energy out can be the AC energy output. The other thing to calculate is the reference yield, which is the in-plane irradiance that's measured. So it's the POA divided by the reference irradiance, and that's usually standard test conditions, so 1000 watts per square meter. Now, the way to calculate the performance ratio is to take the ratio of this PV system yield divided by the reference yield. And in a formula, it looks like this. And in these calculations, we have omitted the summations, which would make it a bit more complex to go through. So here we like to keep it a bit simple. Now, what happens for bifacial plants? It's roughly the same. So again, you calculate the PV system yield, which is the same as for a monofacial plant. And you also calculate a reference yield, where the difference is that instead of only using plane of array, now you use sort of an effective irradiance, which is the plane of array plus the bifaciality factor. This is the module parameter times the plane of array rear. So the change is that instead of only plane of array, we have plane of array plus the plane of array rear times the bifaciality factor. Now, again, as in the monofacial case, the performance ratio is the reference yield, the system yield divided by the reference yield. And when you write it out, it looks like this. And so the change has been that instead of only plane of array, there is an effective irradiance, which is plane of array plus the bifaciality factor times plane of array rear. Now, some more considerations we will discuss now are some of the differences between the amount of irradiance on the front and on the rear of the module. And we have done some simulations for different albedos and for different locations in Saudi Arabia and the Netherlands at different mounting heights, so 0.8 meters and 1.3 meters. And we have here you see the bifacial gains, and you see that for green grass, you have lower bifacial gains than for fresh snow. And what we can say, if we would go to a quite optimal situation where we have white fleece on the ground in the Netherlands at a mounting height of 1.3, we see roughly 30% bifacial gain. So that means that approximately 25% of the total power production comes from the rear side. Therefore, what we think is that a measurement uncertainty of the rear irradiance gives a smaller contribution to the performance ratio calculation uncertainty. To write it down in numbers, here we have the formula for the performance ratio for a bifacial plant, where we have plane of array and phi times plane of array rear. So for this example, where we have white fleece on the ground, we would have roughly 77% contribution from the plane of array and only 23% contribution from the plane of array rear. So what we think is that therefore the uncertainty of the plane of array measurement contributes more to the performance ratio calculation, and the uncertainty of the plane of array rear measurement contributes less to the performance ratio calculation and the corresponding uncertainties. Now this was the last thing. Now we move on to the summary. This is a graphical summary. So we've talked about where in the plant to mount the sensors. And for a fixed plant, we see that at the edges is not good. So stay away from the edges, preferably more than 3 modules away, and avoid the northernmost, or for the southern hemisphere, the southernmost back row. And for a tracking plant, the result is fairly similar. Stay away from the edges, as then you would be measuring way too much irradiance. on the rear side, and it would impact your performance ratio. So you would get a lower performance ratio than the actual performance ratio should be. And also stay not on the westernmost or easternmost row, as this would also impact your measurement. Now, we've also seen that the mounting position has an influence on your plane of array rear measurement, and this is for tracked as well for fixed. And we see that for tracked plants, you have an influence from the torque tube, and in fixed this is less so the case, but we've also seen that it's difficult to select a single measurement position which always captures the true average irradiance. So the recommendation here is to use multiple measurement sensors on the back. We've also looked at some of the variations you can get in the bifacial gain as a function of albedo and time of day, the latitude and the weather. And what was discussed is the IEC 61724, which recommends 3 times the amount of power rear sensors compared to the plane of array sensors. And in case of a pyranometer, it recommends class C or better. And for the performance ratio calculation, the change is from a monofacial plant that instead of only using the plane of array, to use an effective irradiance, which is the plane of array plus phi times the plane of array rear. So with this, we have come to the end of the presentation, and I would like to thank you for your attention. And if there's any questions, I'm available to answer them.
Thank you very much for your time and explanation, Marc. It's really interesting. And I have some question here, and I think for now we have time to answer between 2 and 3 questions. The first one is, how many albedo meters are required to measure site irradiance, and how to simulate that data?
Okay, as I understand this, the question is how many albedo meters are required. This is prescribed in the IEC 61724-1, and it depends on the size of the plant. So if you have a plant which is larger, then more albedo meters are required than if you have a plant which is smaller. And out of the top of my head, I would not know the exact number, but it depends on the size of the plant. So if you have below 40 megawatts, then the IEC has as a multiplier 2. So that means that if I get it correctly, that means that you would have 2 albedo meters. And if your plant is progressing in the size it has, so above 40 megawatts, then this multiplier in the IEC standard goes up to 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 if you're above 700 megawatt. So an exact answer would depend on the size of your particular plant. And okay, Trang, can you repeat the second part of the question?
And how to simulate that data? What to do with the data? Simulate, yeah.
That's a good question. At this moment, my interpretation is that the market is still trying to figure out exactly the way to do it, but the thought in the standard is that to use a software tool, and what software tool that is not described, to calculate a plane of array rear by means of having the albedo input as well as plane of array, global, and optionally diffuse measurements as an input, to let the software tool calculate a plane of array rear that you would then input into the performance ratio formulas. So hopefully more about that will be known in the future.
Thank you, Mark. And there's another question. For Rearside IRradiance measurement, solar reference can be used instead of pyranometers.
Yeah, there's two schools of thought, and in the standard there is the possibility to measure with a pyranometer or with a PV reference device, and it would depend on which school of thought you want. Do you want to capture all the irradiance there is? Then the pyranometer is the good way to go. If you want to have a matched irradiance measurement, then you would choose a PV reference device. And yeah, it depends on which approach you take to the measurement system.
Got you. So we still have the time for a few more questions, and this is the next one. Can solar reference cell can be used for measuring Rearside IRradiance?
Yeah, this is similar to the previous question. The standard tells you that you can measure it either with a PV reference device or a pyranometer, and it depends again what you want to do. We think that a good way to measure irradiance, if you want to measure all the irradiance there is to choose a pyranometer as your measurement device.
Got you. It seems, yeah, we really have a lot of questions, and so we have a few times, so I will just read one or two more. So there's one question that the rear sensor for tracking plant in your example was mounted beside the torque tube, not on it. Maybe having it on could avoid the dip in the graph you show. What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a very sharply spotted. It does matter. You can, in the simulation software, you can choose how you model the module and the plant, and then you can also select what the torque tube would look like, and it influences whether you have this dip, yes or no. And it is nice that the builders of this software have allowed users of the software to configure this and to model it as in order to best simulate the plant they have. So it's an option that can be chosen, and maybe it is nice to see the interface. I'm moving there. Yeah, here in this interface, you can see the torque tube parameters, and you can turn it on or you can turn it off. You can select the diameter, and you can select the size or the shape of the torque tube, whether it's reflecting or whether it's black. And you can also here in the module parameters define gaps between modules. So you can you can simulate quite a number of different situations with different types of torque tubes and different gaps in between the modules.
Got you. Thank you. I have really one more interesting question. Which standard of Albedo or methods we can use before construction of the PV plant, especially it's in desert condition where too much bushes and vegetation?
When doing prospecting, it's best to use albedo meters, and an example can be seen here. So here in this case, we have a two class A pyranometers mounted, one looking up, one looking down. So this is a good recommendation if you want to have solid prospecting data to take an albedo meter with class A pyranometers.
Got you. So I think we also, that's the question that we have for today. So I think that's all of the question that we have. So thank you everyone for your time, and thank you Mark for your presentation and for the answer for all of the questions that we have. And yeah, so thank you everyone again, and we wish you a very nice day. Uh,